Hi, and welcome to the PowerPoint on conflict theory. Conflict theory is part of constructivist theory. It is rooted in Marxist theory, and constructivist theories all start by critiquing the idea, or basically disagreeing with the idea, that there's one objective reality. What constructivist theories say instead is that there are several perspectives on reality and how you construct and view reality is based on where you sit, your positionality, your intersectionality, your place in the hierarchy of society. For criminology, there's a couple important things that conflict theory says. First is that, one, what is considered a crime is a construct, so that there's no necessarily agreed upon definition of what crime is. Crime is something that is defined by the people in power, and it's a tool or mechanism to help them maintain their power and keep people who aren't in power out of power. The other thing that conflict theory and constructivist theories say is that they criticize this idea that concepts can be quantified. And since most criminology and criminological research is quantitative based, conflict theory criticizes essentially all of that research. It says you can't measure crime because crime is constructed, and what one person defines as crime, another person might not define as crime. And more importantly, as one society, what that society defines as crime, another society might not. But conflict theory doesn't believe that you can count the number of crimes. It doesn't believe in any of the research that goes to say, okay, if we have this level of economic income and this level of jobs and, this many police and this many after school programs and this many churches and this many blah, blah, blah in a neighborhood. There are lots of criminologists who use modeling like that in order to predict the number of crimes and then also suggest ways to intervene or to prevent crimes. Conflict theory says that you can't do any of that modeling because of the constructivist nature of crime. If what I see as crime is different from what you see as crime, then counting crime is not going to be of any help. So with that, let's go on a little bit further into conflict theory. I'll also note before we go on, conflict theory is kind of partnered with feminist theory, green theory. They all are meta theories that look at how groups in societies interact, not individuals. They see individuals just as members of groups, and are critiquing the social economic structure or the gender structure or the environmental structure, along with looking at crime. In addition to being aligned with Marxist theory, conflict theory is also aligned with labeling theory. Labeling theory looks at how an individual gets the label of criminal and how that affects their future opportunities and choices. Conflict theory looks at and questions how values in society are formed and who forms those values and influences society, and how they influence society. Conflict theory says that ultimately those in power get to decide what is acceptable behavior for people in society and what is unacceptable behavior, and that those in power, whatever they deem is unacceptable, a portion of that gets labeled crime, no matter what the behavior is. It might be a good behavior, but it gets labeled as unacceptable because it is something the powerful elite don't want, and they can label it crime. So this is also to say that conflict theory really looks at power dynamics in society. It looks at where there's friction or disagreements, and it aims to explain crime as something that is an outgrowth of an underlying disagreement between factions of society, usually the elite and the non-elite. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about theories of law. The first theory of law is really referred to as consensus theory. It is the belief that members of society or a culture have the same values and norms, and that creates a social consensus. And part of the way that social consensus is created is through laws that codify the norms. Durkheim believed that the transformation of society from the mechanical to the organic could be illustrated through the transition of law into a law that indicated that solidarity is preserved through individualism. In other words, when law really protected individuals, a society had completed the transformation from mechanical to organic. I should also add that Durkheim is pictured in the photo that's off to the right-hand side of the slide. Social action theory was founded by Max Weber, and as you can see on the slide, there's a little bit of a Weber joke. A lot of times people refer to Max Weber as Weber, like a Weber grill. Weber is German, and so his name is said as Weber, like with a V. Weber really looked at the modern sociology of law, and he looked at law in its relationship to political authority. He said, and actually outlined several characteristics of a rationalized legal system, and he said that the legal system and laws are in large part guided by an application of procedures, an equal application of procedures, so that anyone who, for example, makes a claim through the legal system goes through the same procedures to have that claim evaluated and ultimately adjudicated. And if you are a person who is a criminal, you have the same procedures that you encounter no matter your race, religion, gender, that sort of thing. Finally, we'll talk about the influence of Sumner on consensus theory. Sumner thought that the codification of laws, essentially through legislation, so the making of laws, and court rulings were illustrative of what he called, quote unquote, prevailing folkways and mores, unquote. Folkways and mores are the acceptable ways society sees as getting things done. So example, it is a folkway to become rich by owning your own company. It is a folkway to become rich by developing your own pharmaceutical. It is a more, it goes against mores to sell drugs. It goes against mores to rob people. And Sumner says that that is because the ruling classes have set up the laws of society to make it that their mores and their folkways become what the legal system says is okay, and that anyone else's mores and folkways are deemed illegal by the laws. So Sumner really starts to think about how those in the privileged class use law to legitimize their position and to delegitimize the position of others, including others that may threaten them. One other note, functionalist theory is another type of legal theory, and it analyzes law based on the functions that law and legal rules serve for society. It also looks at branches of government, interest groups, and other actors. So it says, what does law do for society?
In a capitalist system, criminal law is believed to reflect the will of the elite, or at least the economic elite. And as defined by conflict theory, the elite consists of large corporations with power. These elite impose their definitions of crime and deviance upon those who lack power. So the starting point of analysis that involves conflict theory is an understanding of the economic organization of society and the impact that organization has on law formulation and law violation. So understanding the relations between classes, understanding how different social classes affect the making of the laws that goes on in Parliament or goes on in a leader's office, and understand how socioeconomic status impacts law violation. Excuse me. Here, conflict theory separates from other theories of deviance, which do not emphasize the structure of society or history, but rather they look for the causes of crime in genes or in personalities or from family or friends or from disorganized societies. According to conflict theory, these theories overlook the legacy of capitalist inequalities that are present in economic circumstances, and they also overlook class, race, and gender hierarchies that are connected to economic inequalities. So the mainstream theories look at crime as a temporary and episodic condition, but conflict theorists look at crime and deviance generally as the outgrowth of long-term structural problems. Conflict theory stems from how the theory perceives laws as forming. Most theories think that laws are passed based on shared values of communities, upholding what is good or what is right or what is just. Most people would say that laws stress the positive and note the benefits of laws to members of society, to all members of society, or to almost all members of society. But conflict theorists wonder if the criminal justice system reflects communal interest. Why do so many people commit crimes? Why are some behaviors considered criminal at one point in time but not at other points in time? Conflict theorists lack or point to a lack of uniformity in values as being part of the underlying nature of people. So if you have a large group of people, they will not agree on core values. That is underlying belief of conflict theorists. And to some extent, conflict theorists have a point, even if you don't agree with them on other things. Think about how acts such as possessing marijuana or being a prostitute or gambling are legal in some places but not in others. Possessing marijuana is legal in DC, but it is not legal in Virginia. Being a prostitute is illegal in most parts of the United States, but legal in certain parts of Nevada. Gambling is legal in many states and illegal in other states. So if these crimes or these actions were universally against moral order, wouldn't they be banned everywhere? So conflict theorists think that the elites use laws to control the powerless in order to support the interests of the elites. In large part, conflict theory argues that the elites do this by criminalizing the actions that are not in accordance with the beliefs of the elite. Conflict theorists are sometimes referred to as critical, new, radical, dialectical, socialist, and Marxist criminologists. All of these theories start with a Marxist understanding of crime. Marx and his compatriot, Friedrich Engels, who you've probably heard about, argued that all aspects of life were determined by the social organization of society, specifically the outcome of class struggle and the bourgeoisie's attempt to keep down the proletariat. Marx overall did not discuss crime at length, but he felt that it was essential that humans be productive in life. At the same time, he saw capitalist societies as denying that option to many people, leaving them demoralized, which would then lead to crime. Marx called these demoralized individuals the lumpen proletariat. He thought the belief that people joined in a social contract for the common good and laws representing common interests were a denial of the fact that there was an unequal distribution of wealth produced, and there was thus an unequal distribution of power in society. Conflict criminology began in the 1930s when Thorsten Selin began examining cultural rules that required certain types of individuals to act in certain circumstances. He saw groups struggle to maintain or improve their standings in ongoing competitions with other groups, particularly ongoing economic competitions. Consequently, he thought that rules were put in place by the groups that had the most power, and laws became reflections of deep-seated rifts between groups and societies. In 1969, Turk concluded that the conditions under which difference between authorities and subjects leads to criminalization occurring. So the larger the difference between the person holding the power and the person being subjected to the power means that there is more likely for there to be rules that put into place that criminalize the behavior of the person that does not have power. Turk also said that criminal status is a label that the authorities give to their subjects who are the most threatening to them. Later, Marxist or radical criminology came about in the 1970s, is when it really started to take off. Marxist theorists related power to crime and divided themselves into three separate categories: instrumental, structural, or dialectical. Instrumental Marxists consider the ruling class to be a small and unified group that uses the law to dominate the poor and advance their own interests. Instrumental Marxists view street crime as a form of political rebellion. Structural Marxists consider the views of instrumental Marxists to be too simplistic. If law was just another means of oppression, why would there be laws that empower the proletariat, such as freedom of speech or protections for health and safety, especially at work? Or why would employers be legally bound to pay for unemployment insurance, at least in the United States? Instead, structural Marxists argue that the ruling class is not as unified as instrumental Marxists portray it to be. but that its members disagree and compete over resources. As part of this, certain members of the upper class find a benefit in extending rights to the lower class in order to gain their support. So rights like freedom of speech or unemployment insurance at work are the ways of the upper class, or certain parts of the upper class, more specifically, to gain the support of the lower classes, according to structural Marxists. Finally, dialectical Marxists criticize the structural approach for ignoring real, legal victories for the poor. They agree that the ruling class does utilize the law against the poor, but they also realize the law restricts what the wealthy are able to do. They realize rule of law in democratic societies limits the use of power. Conflict theory has several assumptions. The first is that competition over scarce resources, especially money and power, is at the heart of social relationships, and competition, not consensus, characterizes these relationships. The second is that inequalities of power and reward are built into the social structures and our social relationships. The third is that groups that benefit from any particular structure strive to see it maintained. So whatever benefits you, you want to keep that system in place. The fourth is that change occurs as a result of conflict between competing interests rather than through adaptation. So the system isn't becoming more functional due to being around longer or due to finding innovative approaches to delivering services simply to, let's say, simplify service delivery, but rather a system or a bureaucracy will find a better way to deliver services because there's competition in a bureaucracy for who gets promoted, and people get promoted based on improving service delivery. That's an example of what they're talking about here, is change occurring as a result of conflict between competing interests rather than through adaptation. The theory also assumes that change is often abrupt and revolutionary rather than being incremental. Although conflict theorists see criminal law as being used by the powerful to designate groups as deviant because it is in the interest of the ruling elite to do so, there is some societal consensus that, at least about some behaviors, they are morally wrong, and there's not conflict over behaviors that are criminal. Behaviors such as murder, assault, and rape are not part of conflict theory because almost everyone agrees that these behaviors are evil or wrong or against the interests of society in and of themselves. This is to say that because conflict theory can't address crimes like murder, assault, and rape very well, because there's no conflict, everyone sees those crimes as wrong. It has a very limited application in many instances. Conflict theorists adopt a definition of crime as a social situation, a set of relationships, rather than as an act or a behavior under a specific legal definition. So crime is political, and labeling something a crime is thereby an act of political power. Corporations who pollute the air or water are rarely labeled criminal. If they were, we would consider things like Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola to be criminals. But the people who steal from corporations are labeled criminals. So if you work as a delivery driver for Coca-Cola and you steal 25 bottles of soda and your boss catches you, you will be put on trial and prosecuted, as a criminal. but everyday actions of the poor are likely to get labeled crimes. This means, think about it like this. Compare how white-collar criminals and street criminals are discussed in larger society. Street crime is focused on by the police and in legal efforts, but white-collar crimes such as embezzlement, price fixing, and consumer deception affect more people, but are rarely focused on by the police. Corporate crime is 13.5 times more deadly than homicide, but it is rarely addressed. Conflict theory also notes that it is not just the general public that is obsessed with what many people label, quote, nuts, sluts, and perverts, unquote, but really criminologists are obsessed with these groups as well, rather than being obsessed with studying corporate crimes, which are far more detrimental, many would argue, and, according to many, far more widespread. Conflict theory believes that there are two consequences of criminologists and society's focus on street crime generally. The first is that as long as there is so much anger and concern about violent crime, corporate crime will not be prosecuted. And the second one is that the public is led to believe that the criminal justice system is protecting them from crime. But in fact, it is only protecting people from a few types of crime, and according to some, not even the most dangerous types of crime. When we start to talk about research on conflict theory, there are really four types. The first is research that looks at the interests or the influence of interest groups on legislation, administrative regulations, and court decisions. A wide amount of this literature looks at research on prohibition in particular. The second type of research is research on public opinion, specifically agreement or disagreement about what behaviors are disapproved of by societies and how strongly society approves or disapproves of these behaviors. Overall, this research has failed to find substantial group-linked differences in public perceptions of crime seriousness. So it appears that there's no significant difference between how men and women, for example, view the seriousness of certain crimes, or how people of different ages view the seriousness of certain crimes. The third is that research on the relationship between the presence of threatening social groups and their impact on crime control efforts within a certain area. A researcher along this line has looked at how certain groups are more likely to perceive criminal injustice. For example, researchers found that blacks are more likely than whites to perceive injustices, particularly in the criminal justice system. The second one is that regardless of race, members of the unemployed are more likely to perceive injustice, especially in the criminal justice system. The third is that class positions condition the relations of race to the perception of injustice, with divisions between the races being most acute in the perception of injustice, and with divisions between the races being most acute in the professional class. 4 is that research on the exercise of discretion in applying the law against violators of it, and how that discretion ultimately favors the elite in society. This is the most often conducted type of research of these 4 different types. Overall, it finds that criminal justice officials use their discretion to inflict harsher punishments on those who are the most powerless. Next, we're going to move on to talking about measurement issues in conflict theory and conflict analyses. The first is power. Power overall is considered a basic characteristic of social organization. It is typically considered a threat that is generally described as the actual or perceived potential of a minority group to pose a realistic challenge to political or economic control. The question is, who constitutes the greatest threat to the elite and their control of power? The answer is, of course, the lower class. The second concept that is measured in conflict analysis is social class. Social class is typically considered a hierarchical distinction between groups or individuals. How do we conceptualize social class, though? There are many different methods of conceptualizing it in research today. Most often, it's yearly income. Sometimes it's number of years of education, and at other times it's amount of total wealth or outcome, social outcome. But this doesn't accurately reflect Marx's view of classes, and since Marx was the founder of Marxism, which is the basis of conflict analysis, it's important to note how far we've deviated from Marx's initial ideas about what social class was. Marx considered classes to only really be defined in relation to each other. So you can only define the proletariat in relation to the bourgeoisie. And that's not how we define class today, especially if you're using measurements like what's your yearly income. Check one of the following boxes: $0 to $15,000, $15,001 to $30,000, $30,001 to $45,000. Like, those aren't relational. But saying, are you a member of the proletariat or are you a member of the bourgeoisie? Those are relational answers. Marx also, as part of saying, are you a member of the proletariat or a member of the bourgeoisie, he was dividing classes as an extent of control over the means of production. So do you own the means of production or do you have to sell your labor? And that's also something that we are missing using any of our current methods for measuring social class. One of the other problems with how social class is considered in a lot of critical analyses or conflict analyses is that it is combined with race, so that class and race become a single variable at times. And if you consider that, it can be really problematic because a lot of times it would consider, for instance, being Black to be an automatic sign of being of the lowest social class. You should think about examples of how that is not true within American society. There are numerous African Americans who would clearly be of a much higher social class than the working class or the poor. So this is a problem that conflict analysis has when it conflates race and class into a single measurement or a single variable. Race does not equate to class. When we talk overall about operationalizing social class, there are also some additional problems. As I mentioned, there's no consensus among criminologists on how we should measure it. But studies, as I said, typically measure income level, poverty status, unemployment, and sometimes education level, and race. But but typically it's income, and we have to think, does one's income always represent one's social class? You can make a little bit of money at your job, but you could have great wealth due to inheritance. You can make a lot of money, but you could have no wealth due to debt. So how do these situations relate to a concept of class or a measurable concept of class? Or you can think about it like this. A lot of times, janitors and craft beer makers make the same amount of money in a year. But the social class of a craft beer maker is going to be typically much higher than the social class of a janitor. The next concept that conflict analysis incorporates is economic inequality, which is defined as the unequal distribution of income or other economic assets between groups in society. And the idea is that inequality leads to more crime in a certain population, specifically the poor. Next is the idea of surplus or problem populations, which are labeled with either the idea of being social junk or social dynamite, which poses a threat to the established order either way because they constitute a drain on social resources. The drain on social resources is the junk, or because they seek to radically alter social conditions. Similar assumptions are made about all surplus populations, and one of them is that these populations must be managed through formal social controls, such as the prison system or the welfare system. In most cases, a measure of unemployment serves as the sole proxy for the amount or the number of people in a surplus population. Dynamite is a surplus population that has to be managed and controlled through increasing social controls. One problem with measuring either junk or dynamite in these studies is that a lot of times our measurement comes from formal statistics, especially unemployment. And unemployment chronically underreports the number of unemployed. So there are problems with using unemployment as a proxy for surplus or problem populations. Another problem is that the theory does little to measure what is assumed to be dynamite. Dynamite overall you can think of as the combination of being young, being a minority, being male, and being unemployed. So because we look at just unemployment as our measure of typically of junk, then when we would need to parse out the number of young, male, unemployed minority youth, and a lot of times these studies don't do that. The other thing is that it doesn't make it clear how great a number of people you need in a population to be, or what percent of a population you need to be young, minority, male, and unemployed in order for there to be a genuine threat, for that dead dynamite to really possibly go off. Overall, as you have probably noticed, many of these concepts are pretty fuzzy. And the literature states that the theory's concepts overall are not well defined or well integrated. And by not well integrated, what they really mean is too well integrated because they are tautological. The next part of the theory that we'll talk about is crime control, which is lawmaking and enforcement, and threat, or more specifically, perceived threat. Ideally, threat should be measured directly through surveys that question people about their perceptions and beliefs of the threats that they face and the possible threatening actions they face or that they have faced. Yet researchers almost always measure threats through looking at crime rates and comparing the number of people in the upper class to the number of people in the poor class, or the number of people in the upper class to the percent of Black population in an area. None of that directly measures threat, and some of it is blatantly race biased, especially those measurements that, or the operationalizations that presume percent non-white is equivalent to threat. As I noted previously, the tautological problems have led researchers to state that, quote, conflict theory is frequently able to explain everything and predict nothing, which is a pretty substantive critique of conflict analysis. If we want to talk about criticisms of critical theory or conflict analysis, one is that it is untestable. So the theory states how the system ought to operate is what people claim when they want to say that critical theory is untestable. It doesn't really assess how the system does operate, they would argue. Others would argue that the system, or that critical analysis and critical theory is meant to challenge positivist aspects of scientific thought, and thus critique criminology and criminologists, rather than offering alternative explanations for crime and why people become criminals. The untestability aspect of conflict and critical theory is especially true for peacemaking criminology and Marxism. Other criticism of conflict theory is that it is a theory of law formation and application rather than law violation. This means that the theory is essentially one that explains society from the top, or like government, down to the people, rather than one that explains things bottom up, which would be one that explains like criminal behavior. People's actions lead to influence in and reactions from the government or the top. The key thing to note here is that the causal arrows are very different in the two models. In the first model, government causes people to act a certain way, or the government's rules cause people to act a certain way. In the second, individuals cause the government to react a certain way. This is another way of saying basically top-down government sees the government and law as holding power over people and controlling their actions, whereas the second version sees people as having power over and influencing the government. Another concern about critical theory or conflict analysis is that the theory's explanations for crime are too simple, especially in the Marxist views of crime. If the Marxist views of crime were true, then crime should be high in capitalist societies and low in socialist societies. But data shows that isn't the case. Industrialized capitalist societies in the United States and Germany and Japan and Sweden are all equally pretty capitalist, yet they have a wide variation in their crime rates, and that shouldn't be the case if critical and conflict analysis are true. They should have identical crime rates, or nearly identical ones. And when you compare states' crime rates, states that have transitioned from being communist to now being capitalist, some of those states have crime rates that are lower than they were under communism. Some have crime rates that were higher than they were under communism. And this completely refutes what conflict theory suggests. Conflict theory also has explanations that compete with it and do very well in offering alternative explanations for the types of crime that conflict theory tries to explain. Quote, conflict criminologists are generally able to demonstrate that broad patterns in crime and criminal justice are consistent with the arguments and predictions of their theories, which is good. But the other possible explanations also exist for the same crime pattern. The major problem with testing conflict criminology is distinguishing between conflict explanations and the other possible explanations, unquote. That quote's from Bold in 2002. So this is to say that conflict criminology does not rule out other theories, nor does it explain things that other theories cannot explain. Take, for example, the threat thesis. According to the theory, when a minority population poses a growing threat to the elites, the level of social control in that society should increase. And studies that examine the threat thesis note that when there is an increase in an African American population in a city, that typically does result in more police officers or more arrests for blacks and harsher sentences for blacks. And a positive association between percent minority or percent increase in minority and any of these measurements is typically thought of as support for conflict theory by conflict criminologists. But there are other explanations for this that are equally possible, such as the increases in arrests or harsher sentencing being the result of victims pressing for greater punishments, rather than elites wanting to protect their own position in the social order. Another criticism of conflict analysis is its examinations of extralegal effects. Conflict analysis theorists state that if they find extralegal factors affecting the formation of laws, that leads to support for conflict theory. So if they see elements or evidence of bribery as leading to the creation of laws, that's evidence for conflict analysis. But is that really true? Is there any effective race, gender, or age, or social class evidence of conflict theory? Additionally, the theory assumes that any effect of extralegal variables can be attributed to bias and discrimination against minorities or those low in socioeconomic status. But is that true? Take, for example, the fact that minorities are overrepresented in all phases of the criminal justice system. Is that because the system is biased, because minorities commit more crimes, or both? Or maybe neither. And if the system is biased, it means that it would have to be biased against people specifically due to their race or their social status for for conflict theory to be correct. Another problem with conflict analysis is that the literature only examines formal decision-making points in the criminal justice process, not informal ones, and these informal points may be very significant. Think about the effects of stop and frisk or excessive force, all of which the literature overlooks because it considers the decision to stop and frisk or the decision a police officer uses when he or she decides what type of force to use as being an informal decision-making point. And there's a lot of evidence that there are race-based and class-based biases at these points that make the theory and research that come from the theory then not very meaningful, since it's overlooking all of these informal decision-making processes. In the future, conflict theories have to clearly define what each social category or what the members of each social category want. The theory needs to continue to research racial profiling by police, but it needs to make sure that the operationalization of the concepts that are present in the theory is done very clearly. Finally, it needs to continue examining sentencing differences for crack versus powder cocaine, which was highlighted in the reading. It also needs to continue to press for changes in the law that penalize crack use and crack dealing much more severely than they penalize powder use and powder dealing. The theory clearly illustrates why there is a sentencing discrepancy, because the white elite who control the lawmaking want to ensure that those who are lower on the socioeconomic status hierarchy than them, specifically African American males who are poor, are no longer or are not able to be a threat to them. So they make harsher sentences for the use and distribution of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, because powder cocaine is more likely to be used by whites and crack cocaine is more likely to be used by blacks. The theory does a nice job of illuminating why there is a sentencing discrepancy. Society needs to use this theory and existing and future research that comes from conflict analysis to push for these sentencing discrepancies to be fixed.